And I think we are live. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 Brooklyn Book Festival. My name is MJ Franklin. I'm an editor at the New York Times Book Review, and I'm so excited to have all of you here, both our panelists and our watchers, watching Life as Magically Unusual, a panel about graphic novels that take everyday life and the ordinary and turn them extraordinary. I'm so excited to have this incredible panel of authors and artists with me. I'm just going to read down the list of bios that we have. First up, Shing Yin Khor is a cartoonist and installation artist exploring the Americana mythos and new human rituals. A Malaysian Chinese immigrant and an American citizen since 2011, they are also the author of The American Dream, a graphic novel about traveling Route 66. Next up, Molly Knox Ostertag is the New York Times best-selling author and illustrator of the acclaimed Witch Boy trilogy, which include The Witch Boy, The Hidden Witch, and The Midwinter Witch, as well as the author and illustrator of the best-selling YA graphic novel, The Girl from the Sea. Molly is also a writer for animation and a graduate of the School of Visual Arts, and was also featured in the Forbes 30 Under 30 media list in 2020. She lives in Los Angeles with her wife, 2 cats, and a very cute, cuddly dog who I hope makes an appearance at some point.
It's very close by.
Next up is Olivia Stevens. Olivia Stevens is a graphic novelist, illustrator, and writer from the Pacific Northwest. Artie and the Wolf Moon is her debut graphic novel. She has illustrated for a number of publications, including the New York Times, The Guardian, and the Fire Literary Magazine of Black speculative fiction. Olivia graduated with a BFA in illustration from the Rhode Island School of Design, and when not drawing, she enjoys eating spicy foods and losing her voice at rock concerts. One, I hope you have your voice today since we're on a panel together, and 2, welcome.
Yes, I do.
Well, no one's been out at rock concerts.
We're all
No,
rock
I've had my last one.
But we are not here to talk about rock concerts. We're here to talk about your incredible novels. And so I guess to start, do we just go around, probably in order that I read the bios, and just say a quick elevator pitch of what your book is about? So I'm going to start with you, Shing.
Hello. My book, The Legend of Auntie Po, it's about a 12-year-old camp cook in the 1800s who tells Paul Bunyan stories reinvented as an elderly Chinese matriarch, Auntie Po.
Oh, what a quick, concise, but still like very captivating. Well done. Next up.
Such a good book. I really love that book. Hi, The Girl from the Sea is a young adult supernatural romance novel. It is about 15-year-old Morgan, who is closeted and super anxious about most things in life. And she has a plan to stay in the closet until she gets to college and leaves her tiny town. And finally, she can come out when she's away from everyone who's known her forever. Of course, plans have a tendency to change, and hers changes when she meets Kelty, a mysterious girl who claims to be a selfie, which is a half-human, half-seal mythical creature from the ocean. So that is The Girl from the Sea.
Great, thank you. Okay. And you're up, Olivia.
Found my copy just now. Artie and the Wolf Moon follows the story of Artemis Artie Irvin, who is an 8th grader who accidentally discovers that her mother is a werewolf and that she too may have her own wolf-like abilities awakening inside of her. And during the process of harnessing those abilities and connecting with the greater werewolf community around her, Artie also learns the story of her human father who died before she was born, and that there are far scarier things in the woods than wolves, and they might be out there waiting for her.
Oh, also good pitches. I read these books, and after this, I want to go back and pick them up. But before we get into this conversation, 2 business notes. One is that one of our other panelists, Nidhi Chanani, could not make it, unfortunately, but she is an incredible artist and author, so also check out her book, Jukebox. And the second is I have a second computer here for all viewers, which is to say, if you have questions, drop them in the chat. I'm also looking, and I will try to shout them out during this panel. I have many questions myself, but I'll try to loop in your questions too and make this like a all-around conversation for all parties. But I'm going to start with one of my questions first, which is, all of these books, again, the theme of the panel is turning the ordinary into the extraordinary, right? Magically unusual. And all of your books have a fantastical element, which kind of grow into this new world, this new way of exploring these ideas and topics. I'm just wondering how you came up with the magical element in your book. I'm going to start with you, Molly.
Okay.
Can you tell us about Selkie and Selkies and Keltie in your?
Yes. Yeah. So Keltie in the book is a Selkie, which is it's primarily a Scottish legend, and it's a myth that I have a lot of love for, but there's not a ton of stories or books or movies about them out there. And it's about the classic story is this like half seal, half human person who, when they're wearing their seal skin, they look like a seal. When they take it off, they turn human. And the classic Selkie story is usually a human man stealing the seal woman's seal skin and sort of forcing her in that way to become his wife. And so it's a really interesting, it's like obviously this story with like a lot of like really intense overtones and undertones of like gender and like domestic like sort of like situations. And at the end of every Selkie story, the woman will find her sealskin and return to the sea. And so it also has this tragedy, I think, of when you live by the sea and you kind of like, sometimes people just don't come home. And it's like a story about grappling with that sadness. So I knew that for that, I wanted to explore that. And I wanted to set it in Nova Scotia because that's a place that I've spent a lot of time. So I felt really close to sort of like the ocean there, and there's like so many seals there, and it's really easy to imagine that they could be people. Like they just sort of poke their heads out of the water and it just looks like a bunch of people watching you. So with this one, I really wanted to kind of use it as, I wanted to sort of queer that mythology, but not just like swap the genders, but also kind of explore like, what if this seal skin is freely given, and what if it kind of is more of a sort of consensual relationship, and how do you still explore those themes and explore kind of like being in love with someone who is very wild and is kind of like very unrestrained. And so that was really the heart of the book, and that's where the ideas came from.
I did not know what Selkies were. I had never heard of them before. And so I picked up your book and like was totally brought into this mythology. And then I finished the book, Googled Selkies, read it quite a lot, learned that mythology, and then came back to your book because of how you put tweaks on it. And I loved being sucked into this world. And at the same time, it grapples with ideas and that we've all grappled with, of like accepting yourself and coming out. And I love that spin that you put on it. Olivia, can you tell us about how you came up with your core element?
Yeah, so I think for me, coming of age stories are the most exciting when it's also about coming into your own power. And so I wanted to try something different with werewolves than what I had consumed, so that they weren't, the antagonists of the story, or they weren't playing second fiddle to vampires a lot of the time. So I'd also noticed that there was kind of a lack of like werewolf culture building. And so I wanted to ponder on this idea of genetic werewolves passing down traditions and art and cultural markers that are shaped by their experience as werewolves over time, and how those cultural markers might be misinterpreted from the outside as like, oh, they change on a full moon against their will. But in my story, it's more they change on the full moon because culturally that is how they celebrate their roots as werewolves. So that kind of play between what's already established within lore and what I can expand on or reinterpret in different ways was always really exciting for me. And I really have an affinity for the wolf as like an animal. And like during the process of this book, I just became angrier and angrier on how actual wolf behavior is so removed from werewolf lore, and that they're a very family focused creature, and not like a mindless killing machine at all. And so I wanted to kind of reshape my werewolf lore through that lens of oh, we've gotten this wrong and we need to make it right.
I have a follow-up question, which is, what is it about the wolf, other than just like is it the family-oriented nature? You said you gravitate toward wolves. What is it about wolves that draws?
Yeah, it's the way, well, we've gotten so much wrong in that, like, a pack setup in nature is parents and their children. That's how a pack is comprised. And so that aspect of a family working together to survive, and the parents taking care of their children, and children breaking off to make their own packs and take care of each other even though they're apart. And the aspect of communication through howling is something that really intrigues me. But yeah, basically learning that, you know, the thesis of the wolf is not their violence, because a lot of time they get blamed for things they didn't do. The thesis of the wolf is staying together and helping each other mutually. So yeah.
And before I move over to you, Shing, I wanted to circle back to Molly really quickly and ask a similar question about your selkies and how you landed on them. What is it about selkies that drew you in initially?
Yeah, I think it is also loving the real animal of the seal, and sort of having spent a lot of time in Nova Scotia and been around them, and they're quite friendly. And so just like you can tell that they're so smart. And so kind of like you can tell where the legends came from, and translating that into like a literal like seal turning into a person is, I think that's pretty much it. And they're playful, and they're very beautiful. And I kind of love how they're really beautiful in the water and kind of awkward on land. I think that's like definitely a theme that is in the book. And so it's kind of it's like, I think it's like a little bit of that like classic mermaid story, actually, of just like you're so at home in one place, and then the character ends up in a place where they don't know any of the rules. But yeah, I think it's like Olivia and like the werewolves, it's kind of like reinterpreting this legend that has often been very simple and sort of has had one moral, and then being like, okay, how can we find something else in it, and find like how can we expand this a bit? And that's really fun.
There's a comment that says, the kind of nerdom that I love, combining real world facts, animals, and magic. And I 1000% agree. I want to go over to you, Shing, and ask about your book, because you're telling a mythical story. Can you tell us a little bit about Auntie Po and how you came up with the magical element in the way that it comes to play in this book?
Holy. Well, it starts with being obsessed with Paul Bunyan. And a lot of that comes from, being an immigrant and, being exposed to a lot of that, be more American narrative, like that assimilationist narrative that a lot of immigrants hear. And, I'm a bit of an overachiever. So I'm like, well, if I'm being told to be more American, I'm going to be more American. Like, I drove all of Route 66. Like, I know a lot about Old West history. And I'm going to get obsessed over with America's most mythological figure.
You're like
and I will absolutely make the argument that it's Paul Bunyan, because all the other figures like John Henry, Davy Crockett, Buffalo Bill, Johnny Appleseed, they're all based on real people or events that are extremely believable. While there are no, 30-foot tall lumberjacks and a blue ox, we know this. So I was drawn to Paul Bunyan specifically as America's contribution to the canon of mythology. Because I've always been into mythology, like all throughout my life, it's just always largely been, Greek mythology and whatnot. And when I started researching more about Paul Bunyan, and learning more about logging camps and learning more about forest history, the more I realized how incredibly diverse logging camps actually were. Like, I learned about the Chinese workforce in the 1800s, like logging camps were filled with Black people. They were filled with Chinese workers, Japanese workers, even indigenous workers. And we know that Paul Bunyan stories came out of these logging camps. but Paul Bunyan is almost always portrayed as white. So ultimately, what my book does is it's kind of exploring the idea of who gets to own this myth, like who gets to own this extremely American myth. And, ultimately what I came down to is, well, why not me? I get to tell it. So the main character in my book, May, is doing exactly what people in logging camps were doing at the time. She was carrying on the oral tradition, which is how Paul Bunyan stories were passed. She's just doing it in her own way. And all of us, we put our own personal spins in our own stories. And it's always been like this for me, right? Like, I grew up in fan fiction circles. I grew up listening to people just make stories, do what they want. And so for May, it's really obvious to her that she would, and she doesn't have a mom, that, her Paul Bunyan would be an elderly Chinese woman, Auntie Po. And from there, it's a really obvious lead to, well, what happens when Auntie Po is real?
And that kind of leads me to my next question, which is how did you figure out the anchor of the real world for your story? So you introduce these magical elements, these mystical elements, and they kind of tease out some idea or topic, but then you still have the foundation of your world. I was wondering how you figured out that anchor. And I want to start with you actually, Shing, because the way that Auntie Po comes up is that she first is introduced as a story that one of the characters is telling, and then you kind of meet Auntie Po later on. And initially there's a question of am I hallucinating or not, which is to say Auntie Po fits within this very specific spot in the story, which is first she's the story that's being told before she's introduced, and so the mystical elements kind of weave in and out that way. So I was wondering how you figured out the anchor, that you were going to tell the story of Auntie Po from that distance, etc.
Yeah, I mean, my story's rooted in history, so I was limited to sort of where and when it was going to be set. There was sort of this Venn diagram of kind of during the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act, where there was a lot of violence towards Chinese workers at the time, as well as more or less the period of time that Paul Bunyan stories were gaining traction, or beginning to circulate in logging camps. And for me, it actually felt very naturalistic. Of course, Auntie Po would have to be introduced in a story. May was always a storyteller in my head. But she is also a presence and a comfort when May is trying to deal with, just the horrible things happening around her. I mean, she's 12, she is experiencing racism, but has not yet learned the language of it. Because her father is, navigating his own white adjacency and being no, I want to protect my daughter. I actually want to create this very safe space for her. And Auntie Po appearing for May is her sort of first realization that oh, I actually need more. I need more coping mechanisms here. I do not have them, just by myself. So Auntie Po was always, she started out metaphorical when I was writing the book, and as I was putting the story together, it just made it clear that she needed to be a fairly real presence, a fairly concrete presence. But in terms of kind of deciding between history and magic, it sort of came very naturally, where history is not all that mutable. And magic is how all my characters are trying to cope with history.
I actually want to throw it over to you, Olivia, next, because kind of going off of that, one of the things that Shing said was she felt she needed more. She needed more. And one of the things that I loved about your book, Olivia, is the culture of that Artie finds, right? She finds out that she's a werewolf, but then she's not alone. She has this whole community with her. And so I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about, yeah, anchoring your mythology in the real world, and then the decision to have that community throughout the book and in your story.
Yeah, so I guess for me, there's an element of escapism that kind of decided how the human world was going to work in my story, because like as a Black person that grew up in the Pacific Northwest, there's not a lot of us up here. And growing up, you start to wonder, man, wish I had a greater community here to understand me better, and also just to be able to rely on. And so for me, that I wanted my book to mostly take place within these supernatural werewolf towns where Black werewolves are there having fun and minding their business, because I didn't want the real world ramifications of Artie's life as a queer Black girl in rural Oregon to be what the story is defined by. I wanted it to be rooted in her discovering who she is, discovering this emotional journey that her mother has been through. So I feel like real world wise, it's rooted in the universal concept of family, but I didn't want to ignore, the outside factors of what living here as what you are, how that affects your life, because it does, but it doesn't define it. I refuse to be defined by those things. And so, I kind of tried to operate so that the real world is more on the periphery, so that we can focus on just Black people enjoying each other's company and turning into werewolves. So yeah, I wanted to have fun. There's not enough fun.
There's a moment in your book where Artie asks her mom, or says, I'm not very good at being a werewolf. And then she's like, I'm just like, I need to be better at teaching how to be a werewolf. And then she goes to this community, and there are all these people around her. And it, reading it felt like a hug. Like, they're like,
good.
They're not alone. I loved that. I loved it.
Yeah. I wanted it to, it's a supernatural town, but I wanted it to feel like that. And even in the process, while I was writing the script, I was also gathering a bunch of family photos and cookout photos from me and my family members and my friends. And those are the people that populate those scenes. I wanted those people to kind of be there even in spirit, so that energy could get across. So I'm glad it did.
And what about you, Mel? I have a few questions. I'm going to start off with one, which is, how did you figure out what the real world would be in your book? You have one core Selkie instead of lots of Selkies, or diving purely into that community. So how did you figure out the real world anchor off of which this magical element could grow?
Yeah, I like to sort of use the magic as almost kind of the emotions, given some the emotions of the characters, and these metaphors taking very literal form. And I'm really interested in both approaching it from here's the big emotions, here's the kind of poetic story behind it, but then here's the very physical real world version of this. But yeah, the Witch Boy series is definitely a more highly magical world. There's a lot of magical people and all these different rules. And with The Girl from the Sea, I wanted to take it really simple, because I found on the Witch Boy that when I got into the big rules and the world building, I didn't have quite as many interesting ideas for that. And I really just wanted it to be these very intimate stories of these these sort of magical moments in your life. So yeah, I kind of just tried to keep it as small as possible, and to sort of have it, I feel like it is almost in the book, you kind of almost aren't sure if Kelty is telling the truth about being a Selkie or not. You don't quite get confirmation until the end. And so really I don't know, just having it be this kind of, you are getting pulled along in the same way that the main character Morgan is, where she's not totally sure what's happening, but she's sort of getting caught up in this romance. And by getting caught up in the romance, she's sort of experiencing more and more of the magic of being a Selkie. So
That's
Yeah.
interesting that you said like wanted to keep it as small as possible, because I felt like while Kelty was the only Selkie in that you like kind of like are spending time with in the book, the world felt so expansive, and I think maybe that's because you kind of combined it with the story of someone coming out and the romance and this element, and so like even I didn't even realize, yeah, it's small as possible. Like you
Yeah.
totally stretched it out and like pulled me in this incredible way.
Thank you so much. Really
But
sweet of you.
I wanted to ask about, yeah, just like telling this coming out story in this way. Can you tell me like, yeah, can you tell me a little bit more about that approach of telling Morgan, like who Morgan
Yeah.
is and her challenges?
Yeah, I think I liked the idea that Morgan really is trying to control her life, and it's something I think I relate to both of the characters in different ways, but I think I'm a little bit more like Morgan, where she's trying to kind of put things in boxes, and she's like really good at compartmentalizing things, and you can't always do that, and you can't do that especially with yourself and with sort of like things that you're repressing, and so I think that it's also a very human impulse to do that. And so to have Kelty, who is this kind of like, like coming from the wild, and coming from like, she's like not exactly a seal, but she has like lived her life with the seals. So she sort of is bringing this sense of just like, why don't you do exactly what you want to? Like, if you're not hurting someone, you should just do it. And that's, I think can be like a really cathartic thing to like, so she sort of just like crashes into Morgan's life and sort of like, puts into perspective like how ridiculous it is sometimes, these like walls that we create for ourselves. And I was also interested because like I was saying about the Selkie myth, there is this story of like a man stealing a seal skin and hiding it in his house. And I wanted it to be this very consensual thing, but also Morgan does want to hide Kelty in a way. She's like, I want to keep this relationship secret. I want to, and she's doing that to Kelty, but she's doing it to herself as well. And so having it just be like, as soon as there is another person involved in your coming out, it's not just about you anymore. It's also about this person who loves you, who wants to be seen with you. And so that was like really, really fun to explore. And that kind of really evolved like as the book was being written and as I was starting to sort of draw it, just realizing that dynamic of like, I want to put you in a box versus I am impossible to put in a box, and like seeing where that took them was really fun.
Kelty and Morgan are so like they're like foils of each other in terms of Morgan's trying to figure out how can she come out, how can she say who she is, and one of the first things you see from Kelty is her saying, I'm a Selkie. Here's one. He's like so chipper and vibrant and just like so upfront about it. Which actually leads me to one of my next questions, which is all of these books use this magic, this mythology, and kind of even how vibrant they are, they kind of lead into some pretty heavy conversations. And I was wondering how you were thinking about having those conversations. I think, for instance, Shing, you tackle racism and you kind of expand that and say like, we've always been here as part of these myths and this is our story too, but then also you note that like on these logging camps, there's racism against Asian Americans, against Black Americans, etc. And you really kind of dive in and have these heavy conversations through this magic. And I was wondering, can you tell me a little bit more about how you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, it was really important to me to acknowledge the racism of the era, but also not have any easy answers. Like, you know, at the end, it's wrapped up somewhat neatly. Like, it's like, okay, they are talking about, you know, Asian American girls being able to go to school in San Francisco, but it's pretty rocky for a while there. They've just begun that conversation. And I think a lot of it is that I wanted to create kind of a very idyllic, safe environment of the logging camp, and for it to very much seem that way at first. Like, May's got a best friend, she's making pies, this is all very like Little House on the Prairie. But they can't hide in their little camp forever. And I really wanted to acknowledge kind of all of these different viewpoints and the intersection of privileges that everyone has, and even like the privilege of like white adjacency, where May and her father are more protected than other people in the camp because they are the white foreman's best friend. But that protection's only going to go so far, and so I wanted to be able to write all that while avoiding, easy, well, I'll protect you. Everything's going to be fine from now on. All of the adult characters who are non-white remain fairly skeptical, like all the way to the end of the book. And they are right to feel that. So yeah, I very much wanted to kind of focus on those awkward moments, those awkward moments that are born out of a mismatch of privilege. Because a lot of times, like, it's not explosive. It's not people yelling at each other about, how different they are from each other. It's just this kind of simmering awkwardness where you don't know what to say to your friends, really. And that those moments were what I really, really wanted to write and focus on. Same with queerness. Like, May doesn't have the language for queerness. She does not get like a good gay happy ending with her best friend because her best friend is straight. So I definitely wanted to kind of, do a lot of those little moments, those little heart-achy moments.
One of the moments that was hardest for me to read because of how real and kind of raw it was with May's dad and the foreman, because the foreman throughout is saying, like, you're like my family, I'll always protect you. And then when like May and her family and her community need protecting, he sends May's dad away. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit like how you decided to have what characters experience what, and like, especially since these books are, they're for younger readers too, right? They're for older readers as well, but like they're accessible to younger readers too. And so I was wondering how you assigned like what storyline and what arc to which group of characters.
Yeah, I mean, most of the things happening were going to be happening to the Chinese American characters because it is a Chinese American book and I'm Chinese American, and it just felt right to largely focus on the experience that I know. But I wanted to allude to a lot of the things happening at the time without necessarily portraying it. Because this is ultimately a book for 12-year-olds. And it's not that 12-year-olds can't deal with it. It's just like, researching all this is traumatic enough. Like, I'd like to not like pass on all this trauma like instantly without like a nice vein of hope. And largely the worst thing that happens to a book happens to a white character. And it happens as an accident. It's not an act of racism. It's an act of nature, largely. But that was just an authorial decision. Like, I did not want to kill any people of color in my book.
Thank you.
And that was just. It was just an instinctual decision. Like, no, we've been dying enough. We're good.
Yeah.
Well, I, for one, thought you threaded that line of, touching on some of these bigger, kind of upsetting and heartbreaking and tragic storylines, alluding to them, but not letting them oppress the storyline, not letting them like re-traumatize readers, but still introducing those topics to young readers. So thank you.
Thanks. And honestly, I mean, this period of history is written about so little that all I really wanted was to kind of give people that, oh, I want to find out more about like logging camps and, labor in the 1800s. So I just wanted to start the conversation because there's not much else set in this particular era.
And I'm actually throw it over to you, Olivia, because you've alluded to something when you were introducing your book, which you said there's, you learn about vampires and werewolves and all that stuff and dangers, but the dangers may not be where you seem. Can you tell us what you were alluding to and tell us more about what the journey Artie goes through is?
Yeah, so as far as trying to figure out how to answer that. As far as so Artie's journey is kind of the journey from living fully in the human world to discovering, you know, where she comes from and who her father was, and kind of ending in a place where she is in a community that loves and supports her. But I wanted the supernatural world and the human world in some respects to hold up a mirror to each other. And so there are some bully characters in this story, human bullies, who give Artie a hard time about, you know, being a Black girl. And they are largely harmless, and Artie fights back against them. And I wanted that to kind of mirror the way that she is made to fight back against these vampire characters in the book, who drain her emotionally in a very similar way. So for me, the supernatural element was exciting for me to explore the metaphor of vampirism as white supremacy, as a death cult. So the vampires in the story are largely white, and they are born from death and they feed on death. And so I wanted this story to kind of reflect the ways that white supremacy seeks to destroy communities and sow discord within a community. And that's why canonically the werewolf town, the specific werewolf clan in this book, are the descendants of escaped slaves. And so that tension was introduced because I wanted there to be a through line between white supremacy is parasitic. It's parasitic on the werewolves, but it's also parasitic on the vampires themselves, because they don't have any other motivation than to destroy others. And that's what white supremacy does to all of us. It is not just bad for people of color, it is bad for the white people and people of color who adopt it into their lives. It is born from death. So that as a metaphor was fun for me to, not fun, interesting for me to tangle with and sort of see through visually, just because I wanted there to be sort of a hard time to differentiate between like the vampire characters and these racist human bully characters, to the point where I've gotten comments like, are they vampires too? I'm like, I don't know. Are they? They're doing the same stuff. They're just not drinking blood. So yeah, that's my answer.
Someone dropped in a comment that just says amen.
Thank you.
I have a few other questions, and but we have about a few minutes left. And so just note to everyone who's watching the call, if you have any questions or anything, please drop them in the chat and I will be sure to ask and try to get around to them. That's the sound of New York City. There's a
I thought it was a werewolf.
Given these stories, all of your characters, etc., there's another element to this book, which is that it's a graphic novel, it's visual. And I was wondering how you approached the look and the feel of your books, given the stories that you wanted to tell, given the characters that you wanted to introduce and the ideas that you wanted to explore. I'm actually going to start with you, Olivia, since you were just talking about the parallels between the vampires and the human characters. But I was wondering how you decided on, like, yeah, the look, the feel, the tone, of the story? And did the form of a graphic novel present any opportunities or challenges?
Yeah. I mean, visually speaking, I really wanted there to be like a clear kind of visual language for this speculative werewolf town of descended enslaved people. And so for me, I took a lot of influence from Black folk art and things that I imagined might be passed on through this town because it's a genetic gift they were given. And so I looked a lot, the parents or the paintings of Aaron Douglas really inspired a lot of the look of like the werewolf murals and folk art and these instruments they have, and the quilts of Harriet Powers. Harriet Powers was a folk artist born into slavery, and she made these story quilts that kind of depicted different celestial events and biblical stories and stuff. And I really hooked onto that as a way to kind of tell a story within a story. And so the werewolves in the story use their own kind of quilts to tell their creation myth and tell their history. And yeah, I just wanted those ties to real world folk art elements to present themselves, so then I can speculate and expand on them in this specific way. And so for me, it was very fun and exciting just to play with how to tell a myth that is on a quilt and kind of create that in a comics format. And so it's a very organic, flowing spread of the book that was really exciting for me to do, just because I've never, for me, I try to stick to a format pretty religiously so that when it breaks, it's more impactful. And so that's definitely the approach I tried to give to this book, is that the pieces that stray from the formula, because that is a big moment within the story. Yeah.
What about you, Molly? Can you tell us about the look and the feel of your book and how you decided on that?
Yeah. And Olivia, I just want to say, I think that works so well in your book. There's like, I won't spoil it, but like there is a dark room scene where it's like a full page spread and she realizes something, and I was like, oh my God, it's so cool. I just love drawing comics so much. I love, there's like an escapism to drawing them that I just find really, it's just really wonderful. And especially drawing this during 2020 and just like drawing these places that I couldn't go was really lovely. And so this book is like very much a love letter to this specific part of Nova Scotia that I have all these connections to, because it's just like stunningly beautiful and very, just very like undeveloped in a lot of ways. And so it still is very like unpolluted and gorgeous. And that was really amazing to get to sort of just lose myself in that landscape a bit. And because specifically I was drawing a book about romance, that was really interesting because I've always loved drawing people's interactions and people's emotions. And so figuring out how to do that the most compellingly, and how to really pull the reader in and be like, you're not just looking at like a pretty picture of two pretty people holding hands or kissing, but like you feel like you are in it. And like I don't know like if I was successful or not, but I tried very hard to kind of have it be that like very immersive feeling, and focusing on when you're falling in love with someone and these little moments that you notice, and these sort of moments when you realize you're suddenly really close to them. And it's so like playing with all of that was a really fun and interesting challenge, because it's just a lot more of a internal book than the previous work that I've done. So it's just much more kind of from Morgan's perspective, and it was really cool. And I think I also love comics because I just think the ability to sort of show what you think is beautiful in people, and to sort of draw, like it's just different than anything else, where you just can really sort of see the world through someone else's eyes. And so that was just, it was fun to just try to make something that was really beautiful and like explored. yeah, I had a lot of fun drawing it. I don't have like a lot of good words about it though.
One of the things that I loved about the art in your book is, yeah, you're right. It's like it's such an internal book, and Morgan is isolated for a lot of it. She's hiding from her friends. I think the book opens with her friends texting her, asking, like, "Where are you?"
Yeah.
Keeping Kelty away. So like it is an internal and book, and Morgan's so isolated, but the world of your book and where it's illustrated is so bright and vibrant and like lush, the environment, that again, like you are just like totally pulled in. And I wished I were there too.
Yeah.
I've been sitting in my apartment for the past year and a half, and it's like I want to be like near the ocean and in these hills and in this town. We have just a few more minutes. So before we go, I just had one fun lightning round question, and we'll get to everyone which is, if your protagonist could say something to the people on this call, what would they say? It could truly be anything. It could be about the book. It could be about just like how their day was. Like it could be anything. But if your protagonist could join the Zoom right now, what would they say? I'm going to start with you, Shing.
Tell your own story.
Ah, that's so quick and also good. Tell your own story. What about you, Olivia?
Please buy the book that I'm in. No, find your people and take care of them, because they'll take care of you.
That's it. Two things. One, the please buy your, that's my line. That's my line after.
I was hoping it was going to be, oh.
And what about you, Molly?
I think Morgan would probably say that sometimes your plans will change and sometimes that is the right thing. So don't be afraid of it.
Perfect. Now my line that was scooped on for just a little bit, which is to say, thank you all of you for joining us. This conversation was so fun, and I wish I could have like stretched it on longer and longer. Somehow this 45 minutes went way faster than anticipated, and so just thank you for this conversation. And also just thank you for everyone joining. I've been watching the chat, so thank you for chatting. Thank you for watching and tuning in. Please remember, you can order the books in the link below, so that there's that line. And please consider making a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which this year is celebrating its 16th year of presenting free literary programming. I just want to say, Molly, Olivia, Shing, thank you all so much. Thank you all the viewers for watching, and have a good rest of your Sunday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.